66 days at sea, with only the food you brought sounds impossible. That was the stark reality for every soul aboard the Mayflower in 1620. This is the true story of their culinary survival. A tale not of a single feast, but of a desperate, daily battle against hunger and spoilage. By the end, you will understand exactly how a handful of strange, durable foods kept a colony alive against all odds. We will uncover what was really in their wooden barrels, and why some meals crawled with insects before they even took a bite. What do you think is the most surprising thing a pilgrim never tasted? The success of their entire venture hinged on one brutally simple question. Could they pack enough food to survive the crossing? In the weeks before departure, the focus was not on comfort, but on sheer durability. Every item loaded into the Mayflower's dark hold had to pass a single test. It could not spoil. The ship's quartermaster, a man whose job was a constant battle against rot and rats, oversaw the loading of a floating pantry designed for survival, not enjoyment. From surviving records and ship's logs, we know the core provisions fell into a few stark categories. First, the infamous ship's biscuit, known as hardtack. This was flour and water, baked rock hard to drive out all moisture, creating a substance that could literally last for years. You would need to soak it in broth or water for a long time just to make it edible. And even then, it was more a vessel for calories than a pleasure. Then came the protein, preserved through the only method they had, salt. Barrels upon barrels of salted beef and salted pork, known as salt horse, filled the air with a pungent, briny smell. Dried peas and beans provided essential, if monotonous, starch and fiber. For drink there was beer, thousands of gallons of it, because water stored in wooden casks would often turn foul and undrinkable within weeks. This was the foundation of their diet at sea, a carefully calculated but deeply bleak inventory. They were setting sail with a pantry full of food that was already old, hard and salty by design. Before a single wave rocked the ship, their meals were an exercise in endurance. Within that dark, rolling hold, two foods formed the unshakable pillars of every meal. The first was hardtack, or ship's biscuit. Imagine a cracker, but one baked not for flavor but for immortality. It was simply flour and water, mixed and then baked multiple times until every trace of moisture was driven out. The result was a slab as hard as a roof tile, a food so durable it could and did last for years. Its true enemy was not time, but tiny invaders. In the damp, crowded ship, weevils and other insects inevitably found their way into the barrels. Eating hardtack was a ritual. You would take your biscuit and tap it sharply on the table to dislodge the bugs and larvae that had made it their home. Some sailors preferred to eat in the dim light, a small mercy to avoid seeing exactly what they were consuming. Then, because it was too hard to bite, you would soak it in your beer or in a thin broth until it softened into a soggy, bland mush. This was not eating, it was refueling. The second pillar was protein, preserved in a thick crust of salt. Salted beef and salted pork, often called salt horse by sailors, filled barrel after barrel. The meat was heavily cured in brine, a process that drew out moisture and created an environment where bacteria could not thrive. When a cook went to prepare it, he would pull a dense, dark piece from the barrel, its surface gleaming with salt crystals. It was inedible in that state, tougher than leather and salty enough to make your throat burn. So it required a long soaking, sometimes for an entire day, to draw out some of the salt. Even then, it had to be boiled for hours to become remotely chewable. The resulting stew was stringy, intensely salty, and offered little variety. This was the relentless cycle, hardtack and salt meat, day after day, with the ever-present crunch of weevils between your teeth. These were not foods you enjoyed. They were obstacles you consumed to stay alive. The relentless salt and hardtack were broken only by the contents of another set of barrels. Dried peas and beans were the quiet heroes of the Mayflower's larder, a humble source of vital protein and fiber that could last for years. These hard little pellets were a world away from fresh vegetables. They were harvested and then left in the sun or air until every bit of moisture evaporated, leaving behind a lightweight, compact food that was perfect for a long voyage. On board, the cook would take handfuls of these dried legumes and boil them for hours in a large pot over the ship's small brick fireplace, known as a galley. The result was a thick, starchy mush called peas pottage. This was not a side dish, it was a main course, a bland but filling porridge that provided crucial calories and staved off hunger. To this base, they might add a few scraps of that pre-soaked salt meat, or a handful of oatmeal, another staple grain that stored well. There is also intriguing evidence that they may have had dried corn, or maize, acquired in England from earlier New World voyages. This golden grain, unknown as a staple in Europe, would have been a curious and compact source of energy. These dried goods were the foundation of the one-pot meals that defined shipboard life, transforming from inedible pebbles into a steaming, if monotonous, sustenance that kept muscles working and hope alive, one bowl at a time. Amidst the barrels of salt and sacks of grain, there were a few precious containers that held something more than mere survival. Dairy was a vital source of precious fat and flavor, and the Pilgrims managed to bring a taste of home across the ocean through two remarkable preservations, cheese and butter. The cheeses that could survive such a journey were not the soft, fresh varieties we might enjoy today. They were hard, aged cheeses like cheddar or Cheshire, cheeses that had already undergone a long aging process in England, driving out moisture and developing a dense, crumbly texture. These wheels were then coated in wax, or tightly wrapped in cloth, creating a sealed environment that could protect them from the damp sea air and pests for months. Imagine a cook carefully unwrapping a cloth to reveal a firm, pale wedge. It would be grated or shaved over a bowl of peas pottage, or perhaps eaten in small, precious chunks alongside hardtack, its sharp, tangy flavor cutting through the relentless saltiness of the main diet. Then there was butter, but not as we know it. This butter was a preservation project in itself, heavily salted to the point of being more a condiment than a spread. It was packed tightly into small wooden firkins or barrels, with the salt acting as a powerful barrier against spoilage. A tiny pat of this intensely salty butter, melted into a gruel or spread thinly on a piece of softened hardtack, would have been a profound luxury. These dairy products were not eaten freely. They were almost certainly rationed with great care, doled out by the ship's cook or a community leader to stretch their supply across the vast unknown. Each bite of that sharp cheese, or each taste of that salty butter, was more than nutrition. It was a direct, tangible connection to the green fields and farms of England, a comforting memory of the world they had willingly left behind. But all this hard food demanded something crucial to wash it down, and here the Pilgrims faced a liquid dilemma. The safest, most common drink aboard the Mayflower was not water, but beer. This was not the strong ale of a tavern, however. It was a weak, low-alcohol brew known as small beer, consumed by everyone, including children. Brewing was a daily household skill, and small beer was made by taking the grains used to make a stronger ale and re-brewing them with water, creating a mildly fermented, slightly nutritious beverage. It was boiled during preparation, which killed dangerous pathogens, and the low alcohol content helped prevent the growth of bacteria in the casks. This made it far safer than water, which, when stored for weeks in wooden barrels, would develop algae, turn slimy, and become a breeding ground for disease. Fresh water was a precious, strictly rationed commodity, used mainly for cooking that essential peas pottage. The real hidden danger in this liquid diet, however, was a silent, creeping sickness. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, was the terror of long sea voyages. Its symptoms began with lethargy and sore limbs, then progressed to spongy, bleeding gums, teeth falling out, and old wounds reopening. The Pilgrims knew nothing of vitamins, but they did know that fresh fruits and vegetables could prevent this horrible fate, items utterly impossible to preserve for a 2-month journey. There is a cruel historical irony here. By 1620, some European navies and wealthy merchants knew that lemon or lime juice could ward off scurvy. A few barrels of citrus might have been carried as medicine for the ship's officers or the wealthier passengers, but for the common families crammed in the 'tween decks, such a luxury was almost certainly out of reach. So as they sipped their weak beer and ate their salted food, a clock was ticking inside every person on board, a slow depletion of a vital nutrient they could not name, making the race to land a race for their very health. The true challenge was not just storing the food, but transforming those rock-hard staples into something edible. This alchemy happened in a tiny, dangerous space known as the ship's galley. Picture a cramped brick box, usually built into the deck at the ship's stern. Inside was a small open hearth, a fireplace at sea, its brick lining the only thing separating its flames from the wooden world around it. Here, the ship's cook, one of the most vital yet undersung members of the crew, performed a daily miracle. His tools were simple and heavy, large iron pots and kettles suspended by chains over the fire. His entire purpose was to manage a single, terrifying equation: heat enough to cook for over 100 people, but never so much that it set the entire vessel ablaze. A single rogue spark or a tipped pot could spell disaster, so vigilance was constant. And then there was the ocean itself. In calm weather, the work was merely hot and exhausting. But when storms hit, the galley became a nightmare. The ship would pitch and roll violently. Those heavy iron pots, filled with scalding stew, would swing wildly on their chains, threatening to break free and douse the cook in boiling liquid or scatter burning coals across the deck. During the worst gales, all fires were extinguished, and the community would subsist on cold, pre-soaked hardtack, and whatever else required no cooking, a bleak reminder of their fragility. When the fire could burn, the menu was dictated by necessity. Almost every meal was a one-pot affair, a large communal stew designed to stretch the precious staples. The cook would pour in gallons of water, add the pre-soaked salt meat, throw in handfuls of dried peas or beans and oatmeal, and let it all simmer for hours. This was not cuisine, it was industrial calorie production, a simmering, salty porridge that was then carefully rationed out. The galley was the heart of their daily survival, a place of smoke, steam, constant peril, and the humble, bubbling pot that held them all together. Yet within this world of hardtack and salt, the Atlantic itself offered fleeting moments of culinary salvation. When the winds died down and the Mayflower drifted on calm seas, a different kind of work began. Passengers and crew alike would have scrambled for fishing lines, simple hooks of bone or metal tied to sturdy cord. The cold, rich waters of the North Atlantic were teeming with life, and a skilled hand could pull up a thrashing cod or a shimmering mackerel. This was not just food, it was a miracle of freshness. Imagine the scene after weeks of chewing leathery meat, the sudden shout of a catch, the silvery flash of a fish hauled onto the deck. The cook would not boil this prize for hours. He might grill it quickly over the galley coals or bake it in a pan, its flesh flaking apart, moist and clean tasting, utterly unlike the salty brine of their barrel-stored provisions. For one meal, the relentless monotony was broken. The ocean provided other unexpected bounty, too. Seabirds, curious and bold, would land on the rigging or circle the ship. A well-aimed stone or a cleverly set snare could mean a gull or petrel added to the pot, a small but precious source of fresh meat. There are even accounts from similar voyages of sailors capturing the occasional sea turtle, a massive windfall of meat that could feed many. These acts of opportunistic hunting were about more than nutrition. The very act of catching something, of participating directly in your own sustenance, was a powerful psychological boost. It was a reminder that the world was not entirely reduced to what was sealed in wood and iron. It was a taste of agency, a brief partnership with the vast ocean that was otherwise their prison. Every fresh fish pulled from the depths was a small victory, a burst of flavor and hope that made the next day of hardtack just a little easier to bear. This battle for fresh food was fought against a relentless, invisible enemy. No matter how carefully the barrels were sealed or how hard the biscuits were baked, the damp, salty air of the Atlantic seeped into everything. The wooden casks holding their precious beer and water would sometimes spring a leak or become tainted, the liquid inside turning foul and undrinkable. More horrifying was the slow creep of mold across the food itself. Those rock-hard ship's biscuits, designed to last for years, were not immune. In the constant humidity below decks, moisture would find a way, causing a fuzzy, greenish-white bloom to spread over the surface of the hardtack. A sailor or passenger would break open a biscuit only to find the center soft and spoiled, a betrayal of its very purpose. The heavily salted butter, packed with such care, could also turn, its fats becoming rancid, developing a sharp, unpleasant taste that no amount of scraping could remove. This was more than just disappointment. It was a direct theft of their limited calories. Every moldy biscuit and every rancid pot of butter meant less food for the journey, pushing their carefully calculated rations closer to the edge of disaster. The spoilage from dampness was a slow decay, but the infestation of their stores was an active, unsettling invasion. Rats were the great scourge of any wooden ship, and the Mayflower was no exception. These agile, intelligent pests would gnaw through wooden barrel staves and canvas sacks to get at the grain and dried goods inside. They contaminated far more than they ate, leaving droppings and disease in their wake. Then came the smaller, inevitable invaders. Weevils and other grain beetles laid their eggs in the flour before it was even baked into hardtack. In the warmth of the ship's hold, those eggs hatched, so that the biscuits themselves became a living larder for tiny, wriggling larvae. Cockroaches, too, thrived in the dark, cramped spaces, scurrying over every surface and into every open food container. To eat was to constantly engage with this ecosystem. You would tap your biscuit, as we discussed, to dislodge the bugs. You might skim the surface of your peas pottage, removing any obvious intruders before taking a spoonful. There was no escaping it. These creatures were constant companions at every meal, a crawling reminder of the blurred line between food and filth. When food spoiled or became too infested, the consequences were immediate and severe. Eating rancid fats or moldy grain could cause violent stomach illnesses, debilitating cramps, and diarrhea. On a ship with primitive sanitation, such illnesses spread quickly and could lead to dangerous dehydration, sapping a person's strength when they needed it most. This compounded the silent threat of malnutrition. A diet lacking in fresh fruits and vegetables was already priming their bodies for scurvy. When the core staples of that diet, the hardtack and salted meat, themselves began to rot or be stolen by pests, the caloric intake dropped even further. People grew weaker, more susceptible to the cold, and to other illnesses that inevitably spread through the crowded quarters. The fight against spoilage was not a minor inconvenience. It was a central front in the daily war for survival. The pilgrims were not merely eating poor food. They were often making difficult, grim choices, salvaging what they could from barrels of grain that moved with insect life, or forcing down a meal that their stomachs rebelled against, knowing that to refuse it was to surrender to hunger. Every bite was a calculated risk, a balance between taking in sustenance and inviting sickness. The system of rations, once a matter of routine, now became the central drama of each passing day. As the weeks stretched into months, the carefully measured portions grew visibly smaller. The ship's master or a designated leader would have overseen a grim daily ceremony, the careful doling out of hardtack, a scoop of peas pottage, and a thin slice of salt meat. This distribution was not equal. Historical precedent tells us that adult men, who performed the heavy labor of sailing and maintaining the ship, likely received a full share. Women and older children might get a half or three-quarter share, and the very youngest children received a smaller portion still. Status mattered too. The ship's officers and the wealthier passengers who had paid for more provisions may have had access to a private stash, a small barrel of cheese or butter hidden away, a fact that surely bred quiet resentment in the crowded 'tween decks. But as the voyage dragged on, even those private reserves began to empty. The real crisis was time. The Mayflower was supposed to make the crossing in about 6 weeks. But fierce autumn storms and navigational challenges had blown them far off course. They were at sea for 66 days, nearly 2.5 months. Every extra day was a day their finite supplies were not designed to cover. William Bradford, a future governor of the colony, later wrote of this period with stark simplicity. He described the ship as being, quote, shaken and weather-beaten, and the passengers as being, quote, infected with the scurvy and other diseases, but between those lines lies the unspoken reality of hunger. The communal pot grew thinner, the broth more watery, as the cook stretched the last beans and grains with extra water. The hardtack, already infested, became a precious commodity, each biscuit broken with care to conserve every crumb. Hunger is a quiet, gnawing companion. It saps not just physical strength, but mental resolve. Parents would have given portions of their own meager rations to their crying children. The weak beer, now perhaps running low, did little to fill hollow stomachs. The smell of the ever-present salt meat cooking, once a promise of sustenance, now became a torment, a reminder of the monotony and scarcity they could not escape. They were enduring a slow, communal tightening of the belt, a shared suffering that bound them together even as it wore them down. This was not the dramatic starvation of legend, but a grinding daily depletion, where the thought of land became inseparable from the thought of a full meal. The sight of land on November 9, 1620, did not mean the struggle for food was over. It meant the struggle had changed. The Mayflower anchored off the desolate, winter-blasted coast of Cape Cod, a place of bare trees and howling wind. They were hundreds of miles north of their intended destination in Virginia, utterly lost, and with winter closing its fist. Their shipboard provisions were nearly exhausted, and the land offered no welcoming fields or orchards. The immediate, desperate priority was not building houses, but finding anything edible. Within days, Captain Miles Standish led small, armed parties ashore. Their mission starkly simple: locate fresh water and food before starvation finished what the voyage had begun. These men waded through icy shallows, their boots crunching on the first American soil they would ever walk. driven by a hunger that had been building for 66 days. They scanned the bleak landscape not for beauty, but for sustenance, for any sign of life that could fill a cooking pot. What they found first was not growing in the ground, but hidden beneath it. While exploring the dunes, they stumbled upon something both miraculous and troubling. A large, rounded mound covered with a woven mat and a layer of sand. Carefully digging, they discovered a storage pit, expertly crafted by the local Wampanoag people. Inside were baskets, and within those baskets, a treasure of dried, golden kernels, maize. This was not the small amount of curious grain they might have carried from England. This was a massive cache, a community's carefully saved seed, corn, and winter food supply. The explorers stared at this bounty, a literal lifesaver, but it was not theirs. William Bradford's own account captures the moral conflict they faced. They were starving strangers taking the vital food of people they had not yet met. After much debate, they took several bushels, justifying it as a necessity for survival, but also making a firm note to repay the owners later, a promise they would eventually keep. This act of taking the maize was their first, fraught transaction with the New World, a necessary theft that would feed them through the coming weeks and become the seed, both literal and figurative, for their future. The exploration parties also foraged with a frantic energy. They found and shot wild fowl, likely ducks or geese migrating south. They discovered vast beds of shellfish along the shore, clams and mussels that could be gathered by the basketful and boiled into a rich, briny broth. In the freshwater streams, they found thick patches of watercress, a crisp, peppery green that must have tasted like a revelation after months, without a fresh vegetable. Each clam dug from the sand, each handful of green gathered, was a direct engagement with this new land. It was a messy, immediate, and ultimately successful shift from passively consuming the old, spoiled stores of the ship to actively harvesting the wild abundance of an unknown coast. The food on the Mayflower had been about endurance, a countdown of calories. This new food was about possibility, a first fragile step toward a life they could build. The discovery of that hidden cache of maize was more than just a lucky find. It was an introduction to a sophisticated agricultural world the Pilgrims could scarcely comprehend. They had stumbled upon the cornerstone of a food system that had sustained communities here for generations. A system built not on single crops, but on a brilliant partnership. This was the world of the three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, grown together in a single symbiotic mound. The cornstalk provided a sturdy pole for the bean vines to climb. The beans, in turn, fixed nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing the corn, and the broad leaves of the squash plants spread across the ground, creating a living mulch that suppressed weeds and retained moisture. To the English settlers, used to orderly, separate fields of wheat and barley, this interwoven garden would have looked like a chaotic tangle. They did not yet see the genius in it. They only saw the result, food. That dried corn they took was their first tangible connection to this system. But what exactly was it? They recognized it as a grain, but its large, colorful kernels were unlike any European cereal. Their initial attempts to use it were likely clumsy and confused. They probably tried to grind it into a flour for bread, only to find it lacked the gluten of wheat, resulting in a dense, crumbly loaf. They might have boiled the kernels whole, creating a porridge, but the true culinary knowledge, the art of making nourishing succotash by combining the corn with beans, or of turning dried maize into hearty hominy through a process called nixtamalization, was knowledge held by the Wampanoag people they had not yet met. So in those first desperate weeks, they consumed this bounty in the most basic ways, boiling it into a simple gruel. Yet even prepared simply, its impact was profound. This was not just calories, it was nutrition. Maize is rich in carbohydrates for energy. Combined later with beans, it provides a complete protein. And squash offers essential vitamins. This indigenous triad delivered a balanced meal that their ship's diet of salt and hardtack utterly failed to provide. That single act of taking the buried corn was a lifeline, a massive infusion of energy that literally fueled their first efforts to build shelters and explore. It was also a humbling lesson. Their survival now depended on plants they had never seen, grown by methods they did not understand, in a land that was only beginning to reveal its secrets. That stolen corn was a lifeline, but it was also a puzzle. The Pilgrims held handfuls of the hard, sun-dried kernels, a food utterly foreign to their English experience. Their first instinct was to treat it like the dried peas they knew so well, tossing the kernels into a pot of boiling water. The result was disappointing. A tough, chewy porridge that was difficult to digest and offered little flavor. This golden grain resisted their familiar methods, demanding a new understanding. Survival now depended not just on having food, but on learning how to unlock its nourishment. Through trial, error, and eventual guidance, they would master the transformation of this seed into their primary sustenance. The key was processing. They learned, perhaps by observing the empty mortar and pestle stones left in abandoned Wampanoag settlements, that the corn needed to be broken down. Using crude hand mills or simply pounding the kernels between stones, they produced a coarse yellow meal. This was a revolution. From this meal they could make samp, a thick porridge that became a daily staple. They would boil the meal with water for hours, creating a filling hot mush that could be eaten plain, or on better days, enriched with a precious scrap of meat or a few beans. Another simple preparation was the ash cake. A portion of the moistened cornmeal would be patted into a round cake and placed directly into the hot ashes at the edge of a fire. Once baked, the outer ash was brushed away, revealing a dense, smoky bread. It was a far cry from English wheat bread, but it was portable, durable, and most importantly, it was filling. This shift from whole kernels to ground meal was a culinary adaptation of immense importance. Corn, or maize, became the caloric engine of their survival through that first brutal winter. While their remaining ship's biscuits dwindled to nothing, the cornmeal from the discovered cache provided a steady, reliable source of energy. It was more than just calories, it was versatile. It could be a porridge for breakfast, a cake for a journey, or later, thickened into a pudding. As they slowly established contact and trade with the Wampanoag, their knowledge deepened. They learned to combine the corn with beans in a dish called succotash, creating a complete protein that strengthened their bodies against disease and hard labor. That initial act of taking the seed corn became, ironically, the seed of their own future. The grain they once struggled to cook became the cornerstone of their diet, the golden thread that connected their desperate first days to the eventual establishment of a permanent colony. In learning to prepare corn, they were not just learning a new recipe. They were learning how to live in an entirely new world. The golden promise of that corn could not hold back the coming winter. As the last of the autumn leaves fell, the true test began, a period the survivors would later call simply the starving time. The Mayflower, now their permanent shelter, sat frozen in the harbor, a grim ark surrounded by a landscape turned to iron. Their shipboard provisions, the hardtack and salt meat that had sustained the voyage, were down to crumbs and scraps. The foraged shellfish and watercress were buried under snow or locked in ice. They had landed too late to plant, and they possessed almost no skill to hunt the forests or fish the winter waters effectively. They were stranded between a depleted past and an impossible future, with empty hands and emptier stomachs. Hunger ceased to be a gnawing feeling. It became the central, terrifying fact of existence. Weak from months of poor nutrition, bodies already depleted by scurvy now faced outright famine. Men who ventured out to hunt often returned exhausted, empty-handed, their unfamiliarity with tracking and woodcraft rendering them useless in the deep snow. The shared pot, which had once held thin peas pottage, now contained little more than hot water flavored with a handful of precious cornmeal, stretched thinner each day to feed the living. Disease walked hand in hand with hunger, crowded into the dank, cold ship and their first crude shelters on shore. Their weakened immune systems offered no defense. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and other contagious illnesses swept through the community. A cough in the night could be a death sentence. The most heartbreaking accounts tell of colonists dying alone in their beds, too weak to call for help, or of entire families succumbing within days of each other. The death toll was catastrophic. By the spring of 1621, nearly half of the 102 passengers and crew who had stepped onto the shore were gone. 47 people. They did not die in a single dramatic event, but in a slow, relentless trickle of loss, day after frozen day. William Bradford wrote of this time with a stark and terrible simplicity, describing how 2 or 3 persons died sometimes in a single day. In the depth of that winter, they were forced to make choices that defy modern understanding. There are fragmented, haunting suggestions from later writings and oral histories that in the absolute extremity of their hunger, some may have resorted to consuming things no human should, from boiled leather to the remains of animals long dead. Whether literally true or a metaphor for their utter desperation, these stories underscore a brutal truth. The cost of their food insecurity was measured not in discomfort, but in graves. Each small mound of earth dug into the frozen ground represented a life sacrificed to the simple, impossible challenge of finding enough to eat. The Mayflower, which had been their vessel of hope, became a floating tomb, a silent witness to the price of their journey. Amidst the frozen landscape, the shoreline itself became a lifeline. While the deep forests and winter fields offered little, the edge of the sea remained a place of relative abundance, a pantry that required no hunting skill, only the strength to bend down. In their weakened state, the Pilgrims discovered that the tidal flats and rocky beaches held a salvation of shells. Mussels clung in dark clusters to exposed rocks. At low tide, the sand and mud revealed the telltale air holes of clams. And in the colder waters, oysters grew in rough, grey clusters. This was foraging at its most basic and most vital. Even a child or an adult sapped by hunger could gather these creatures by the basketful. The work was cold and muddy, wading into the icy shallows or digging with numb fingers, but it yielded immediate, tangible food. The cooking method was beautifully simple. They would bring the shellfish back to their fires, rinse them in fresh water if they had it, and then toss them into a pot or even directly onto the hot coals. The heat did all the work. Within minutes, the shells would pop open with a soft hiss, revealing the tender meat inside. The nutritional value of this bounty was profound. Each clam, each mussel, was a compact packet of lean protein, a resource their bodies desperately needed to repair tissue and maintain strength. More importantly, shellfish are rich in minerals like iron and zinc, nutrients utterly absent from their dwindling stores of cornmeal and salt meat. Perhaps most crucial of all was the moisture. Steaming a pot of clams created its own briny broth, a warm, saline liquid that provided hydration and a sense of fullness. This was not a feast, it was subsistence, a monotonous but life-sustaining rhythm. Day after day, through the deepest cold, the shoreline offered this grim repetition. A meal of shellfish was not celebrated. It was consumed with a focused gratitude, a direct transaction with the new world that required no seed, no weapon, and no luck, only the turning of the tide. This daily harvest of the shallows did more than fill bellies. It bought them time, one brittle shell at a time, holding back complete collapse until the earth could thaw and offer a different kind of hope. Spring finally broke the icy grip of the coast in 1621. The snow melted, revealing a softened earth, and the sun carried a warmth that felt like a physical reprieve. For the survivors, those who had endured the starving time, this was more than a change in weather, it was a resurrection of hope. Their immediate survival still relied on shellfish and the last grains of corn, but now they could act, they could plant. With hands still weak from hunger, they turned to the two sources of seed that represented their entire future. From the Mayflower's depleted stores, they carefully retrieved the precious packets of English seeds they had carried across the ocean, peas, barley, and perhaps some root vegetables. These were a tangible piece of home, a faith in familiar crops. But with equal care, they planted the most valuable seeds of all, the kernels of wampanoag corn they had saved from the discovered cache, not to eat, but to sow. This was an act of profound trust, investing their last food into the ground, betting their lives on a harvest months away. As they pressed each seed into the cool soil, they were planting more than crops. They were planting a commitment to this place. The land itself began to offer its own bounty, even before their seeds sprouted. As the days lengthened, the forest floor and meadow edges erupted with life. Tender green shoots, plants the English called sallets, pushed through the leaf litter. There was watercress in the streams again, and new, unfamiliar greens with sharp or earthy flavors. Soon the first wild strawberries appeared, tiny bursts of shocking red sweetness hidden in the grass. To a people whose tongues had known only salt, mush, and the faint metallic taste of starvation, these fresh foods were a sensory explosion. The psychological impact was immediate and powerful. To pluck a berry and taste its bright sugar, to chew a leaf and feel its crisp texture. This was a direct conversation with a land that was no longer just trying to kill them. It was providing. Gathering these wild foods became a daily ritual of discovery. Each new plant a lesson in the ecology of their new home. This slow greening of the world marked the end of mere survival and the tentative beginning of living. The act of planting promised a future, while the wild harvest fed them in the present, stitching together a fragile bridge toward the autumn they desperately needed to reach. But survival on shellfish and wild greens was a precarious, hand-to-mouth existence. The true turning point arrived not with a change in season, but with the arrival of a man. His name was Tisquantum, known to the pilgrims as Squanto. To the starving colonists, he must have seemed a miracle. Here was a man who spoke English, a survivor of his own unimaginable journeys across the ocean, who now stood before them as a bridge to the land itself. His value was not as a translator alone, but as a living library of practical knowledge. The pilgrims had planted their corn, but they were doing it wrong, simply dropping seeds into holes as they would with English peas. Squanto showed them the true method. He taught them to plant the corn in small mounds, and in each mound to place several kernels along with a dead fish. This was a revelation. The decaying fish acted as a slow-release fertilizer, providing the nitrogen the hungry corn needed to grow tall and strong. It was a perfect, sustainable technology, using the bounty of the sea to feed the bounty of the land. But his lessons went far beyond the cornfield. He showed them where the herring ran thick in the streams, perfect for catching and using as fertilizer or food. He pointed out the best places to set traps for game, and where to find the richest beds of shellfish. Perhaps most vitally, he walked with them through the forest, and along the shore, pointing out which plants, roots, and berries were safe to eat, turning a landscape of potential poison into a recognizable pantry. Under his guidance, their desperate foraging became informed harvesting. Yet Squanto was not acting alone. His ability to teach was made possible by a profound political decision. In March of 1621, the Wampanoag leader Massasoit, after careful observation and negotiation, entered into a formal treaty of peace and mutual defense with the Pilgrims. This was not merely a friendship pact. It was a strategic alliance that guaranteed the colony's physical safety. More importantly for their empty stomachs, it created a framework for the exchange of knowledge. With peace secured, the flow of information could begin in earnest. The Wampanoag, through Squanto and others, shared generations of accumulated wisdom about the rhythms of this specific place. When the strawberries would fruit, when the deer would move, how to store food for the winter. In return, the Pilgrims offered trade goods like metal pots, cloth, and tools. This period of stability was the single most important factor for their agricultural success. For the first time, they could tend their fields without fear of attack. They could venture farther to hunt and fish. They could focus on learning rather than merely surviving. The corn, fertilized with fish and tended without panic, grew tall. The beans climbed the stalks, and the squash vines spread beneath them. By the autumn of 1621, the result of this alliance was tangible. A harvest so abundant it could be gathered and stored. That harvest, secured through diplomacy and direct teaching, provided the food that filled the tables at the gathering we now remember as the first Thanksgiving. The meal was not a celebration of having survived on their own, but a profound acknowledgement that they had only survived because they were no longer alone. That harvest of 1621 was the foundation for a gathering that would become cloaked in centuries of myth. The event we now call the First Thanksgiving was, in reality, a 3-day harvest festival in the fall of that year, a celebration of survival made possible by the Wampanoag Alliance. The menu was a direct reflection of their location, the season, and the fragile peace they were building. It bore almost no resemblance to the modern holiday table. So what was actually served? The single largest contribution of meat came not from the Pilgrims, but from their Wampanoag guests. Historical accounts note that Massasoit arrived with 90 men, and they brought 5 deer as a gift. This means venison was the centerpiece, roasted over open fires, a powerful symbol of the partnership that had secured their food supply. The forests and skies provided the rest of the bounty. Men from both communities went out fowling, returning with ducks, geese, and very likely wild turkeys, which were plentiful in the region. The waters of Cape Cod Bay offered up cod, bass, and shellfish like mussels and clams. There are even accounts mentioning lobster, which at the time was so abundant it was considered poverty food, washed up in piles on the beach. From the Pilgrim Gardens came the fruits of their first successful harvest, dishes made from their precious corn. There would have been samp, the thick cornmeal porridge, and perhaps ash cakes baked in the fire. They may have contributed some of their last remaining English staples, like peas or a small barrel of pickled vegetables. But these were dwindling relics. Now consider what was definitively not on the table. There was no pumpkin pie. They had pumpkins or pompions, but without flour for crust, butter or sugar for filling. They would have simply stewed them or roasted them whole. There were no heaping bowls of mashed potatoes, as potatoes were not yet a staple crop in North America. And that cranberry sauce. Cranberries grew in the bogs, but sugar was an unimaginable luxury, so the tart berries would have been eaten plain or used in a savory stew, not as a sweet condiment. The feast was an outdoor event, stretching over 3 days, filled with games, military drills, and shared meals. It was not a solemn religious ceremony, but a lively diplomatic gathering, an expression of profound gratitude for having simply made it through. They were giving thanks not for a perfect bounty, but for the chance to have a bounty at all. The feast was a milestone, not a finish line. In the years that followed, the Pilgrims moved from a desperate, seasonal hunt for food to the steady rhythm of a settled agricultural life. Their diet, once defined by scarcity and spoilage, began to slowly diversify and stabilize, becoming a unique blend of the world they had left and the one they were building. This transformation started right outside their doorsteps with the humble kitchen garden. Around their growing cottages, settlers carved out small plots of earth, fencing them against wildlife. Here they planted the precious seeds they had carried from England, a taste of home carefully nurtured in foreign soil. Rows of peas and cabbages, carrots and parsnips, onions and turnips began to push through the ground. They also cultivated herbs like parsley, thyme and sage, not just for flavor but for their medicinal properties. These gardens provided a crucial supplement, adding fresh greens and vitamins that prevented a return of the scurvy that had haunted them on the ship. It was a daily act of cultivation and care, a small declaration that they were here to stay. The true revolution in their food security, however, arrived on the hoof and the wing. Subsequent supply ships from England brought the foundations of a European farmstead across the Atlantic. Pigs were among the first and most important animals to establish themselves. They reproduced quickly, could forage in the woods for acorns and roots, and provided a reliable source of fresh pork, lard for cooking, and leather. Goats supplied milk, which could be turned into cheese, offering a sustainable source of dairy far beyond their initial dwindling stores. And chickens scratched in the dooryards, providing a steady trickle of eggs and the occasional stewing hen. The arrival of these domesticated animals changed the equation of survival completely. No longer were they solely dependent on the success of a hunt or the yield of a cornfield. Now they had living larders, sources of protein and fat that could be managed and planned for. A pig slaughtered in the fall could be salted and smoked, its hams hanging in the chimney to cure, ensuring meat through the winter. A goat's milk meant cheese could be made regularly, not rationed as a rare luxury. This shift from foraging to husbandry brought a profound sense of security and normalcy to their daily lives. Alongside these old world additions, their fields continued to be dominated by the New World triad they had learned to depend on. Corn remained the indispensable staple, its tall stalks the backbone of every meal. But now they grew it with greater skill, interplanting it with climbing beans, as the Wampanoag had shown them. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, improving the yield, and when harvested together, corn and beans created a complete protein in the pot as succotash. Beneath these plants, the sprawling vines of pumpkins and squash covered the ground, their large fruits providing a versatile vegetable that could be roasted, stewed, or dried for storage. This indigenous agricultural system was brilliantly efficient, and the Pilgrims adopted it wholeheartedly. Their diet became a practical fusion. A typical meal might be a stew of salted pork from their own pig, thickened with cornmeal and enriched with beans and chunks of pumpkin from their field, all flavored with onions and sage from the kitchen garden. It was a cuisine born of necessity, a delicious alchemy of two continents, simmering in a single pot. This blending of resources created a food supply that was finally resilient. If the corn harvest was poor one year, the livestock and the kitchen garden could help fill the gap. They were no longer one failed crop away from starvation. The haunting specter of the starving time began to recede, replaced by the cyclical, manageable challenges of farm life. The story of their food which began as a terrifying mystery of survival at sea, had found its answer not in a single feast, but in the quiet, daily work of building a home. This new world demanded a new kind of kitchen. The Pilgrims arrived with their English pots, pans, and centuries of culinary tradition, but they now faced ingredients that defied their old recipes. The result was a quiet, daily revolution, a fusion of old world methods and new world bounty that gave birth to something entirely new. The cast iron cooking pot, or kettle, became the heart of this transformation. Hung over the hearth fire, it was the perfect tool for a cuisine of necessity. Into it went the unfamiliar venison, a meat far leaner than the fatty beef of England. Simply roasting it would dry it out, so they adapted, cutting the meat into chunks and stewing it slowly with water, adding precious onions from their garden and the wild herbs they were learning to identify. This method, familiar from making pottage, tenderized the tough game and created a rich, savory broth that could stretch a small amount of meat to feed many. The cornmeal presented its own puzzle. They could not make a risen wheat loaf from it, but they could take the moistened meal and pat it into a flat cake. Instead of an oven, they used the heat of the hearth itself, placing the cake directly onto the hot ashes or on a flat stone set near the coals. This ash cake, or what later travelers called a journey cake for its portability, was a direct adaptation. It used an ancient cooking technique, applying it to a grain that refused to behave like wheat. The result was a dense, smoky bread that was nutritious, durable, and uniquely American. Preservation also blended old and new. They knew how to salt cod from the North Atlantic fisheries. Now they applied that same technique to the abundant fish of Cape Cod Bay, salting and drying shad or bass to create a store of protein for the lean months. Smoking meat over a slow, smoldering fire was another practice from home, now used to preserve not just pork, but also strips of venison and even turkey. Perhaps the sweetest fusion came from the forest. In England, sweetness came from expensive imported sugar or from honey. Here they learned from native neighbors to tap the maple trees in late winter. Collecting the clear, watery sap was one thing, but transforming it required their own technology. They poured the sap into their large metal kettles and boiled it for hours over a fire, a process impossible with the birch bark containers used by indigenous people. As the water evaporated, the sap thickened into a glorious amber syrup. This was a revelation, a locally produced sweetener that could be used to flavor cornmeal porridge or preserved fruits. Every meal became an experiment in fusion. A dinner might consist of stewed venison with garden herbs, a journey cake baked in ashes, and a dish of boiled squash sweetened with a drizzle of that precious maple syrup. This was not English food, nor was it purely native American cuisine. It was something else, a resilient, practical, and slowly evolving cuisine, born from the absolute need to make a home in an unfamiliar land. The flavors on their plates told the story of their adaptation, a daily reminder that survival had turned into living. Their table was a world of smoked meat, corn mush, and stewed greens. But if we could step back into their Plymouth home, the sheer absence of familiar flavors would be shocking. The Pilgrims lived in a culinary universe completely alien to our own, defined as much by what was missing as by what was on their plates. Let us start with the great irony: foods from the New World they never tasted. Potatoes, both sweet and white, were growing in South America, but had not yet traveled north or been embraced by Europeans. The tomato was considered a curious, possibly poisonous ornamental plant in England, not a food, and chocolate, the drink of Aztec emperors, was utterly unknown to them. Even the wild turkey on their feast table was a novelty. Nothing like the domesticated bird we know today. Then consider the sweeteners. Sugar was a costly luxury, imported in small, hard cones and used like a spice, not something to sweeten a daily drink or bake into desserts. The idea of a sugar bowl on the table was as fantastical as a flying machine. Their primary sweet taste came from wild berries, maple syrup after they learned to make it, or perhaps a precious dab of honey if a swarm was found. The drinks we associate with colonial life were also absent. There was no coffee, no tea. These stimulating brews would not become common in England or its colonies for decades. They drank small beer, water, and later, cider made from the apples they eventually planted, and the notion of a quick snack, unthinkable. There were no crackers, no cookies, no chocolate bars, no bags of anything. Eating between meals, unless you were doing hard labor, was likely frowned upon. Their food was purposeful, seasonal, and direct from the land or their stores. This starkly limited pantry makes their resilience all the more remarkable. They built a colony, not with convenience or variety, but with grit and a profound adaptability to what the land, and their new allies, could provide. Their survival was a triumph of making a feast from a very short, very strange shopping list. The youngest members of the Mayflower's company faced the same grim rations with even smaller stomachs. For a child, the voyage was a lesson in patience and hunger. Their meals a scaled-down version of the adult's relentless cycle. Each day likely began and ended with a wooden bowl of peas porridge, the bland, starchy mush that filled bellies but offered little excitement. Their piece of hardtack would have been broken for them, then soaked in a thin broth or beer until it softened into a soggy mass they could manage with a spoon. There were no separate menus, no special dishes made to tempt a picky eater. Food was fuel, and everyone from the oldest sailor to the youngest toddler consumed the same salty, durable staples. The concept of a kid-friendly meal, something sweet or specially shaped, simply did not exist. Their world was one of texture and monotony, the constant chew of tough meat, the gritty feel of cornmeal, the occasional unwelcome crunch of a weevil in their biscuit. In this landscape of survival, a treat was not a cookie or a piece of candy. It might be a single dried currant or raisin, saved from a precious hoard and given as a rare reward. If someone managed to discover a beehive, a tiny taste of wild honey on a finger would have been a moment of pure, dazzling sweetness, a memory to cling to during the long, salty days. For these children, the first taste of a wild strawberry on the shore the following spring must have been a sensory explosion, a burst of color and flavor that finally broke the endless beige of their shipboard diet. Their experience reminds us that history is not just about policies and harvests. It is about the small, daily realities of life, about what it means to be hungry when you are only 5 years old, and the world is made of water and hard bread. The true test of their journey is not in the history books, but on your own plate. Could you survive the Mayflower diet? Let us break down a typical day's rations. An adult might receive about a pound of hardtack, a pound of salted meat, a quart of beer, and perhaps a pint of dried peas. In modern terms, this provided calories, perhaps 3,000 or more, but they were empty, punishing calories. The diet was brutally high in salt and carbohydrates, yet desperately low in fresh vitamins and healthy fats. Your body would be in a constant state of rebellion. First, the thirst. The sheer amount of salt preserved in that beef and pork would have you craving water incessantly, but you would be drinking weak beer instead, which does little to truly quench that deep, saline thirst. Then your gums, within a few weeks, without any vitamin C, they would begin to feel tender, then spongy. You might notice a strange looseness in your teeth, a frightening prelude to scurvy. Your digestion would be a daily trial. The rock-hard biscuit, even when soaked, was difficult to process, leading to cramps and constipation. And with every bite, you would be hyper-aware of texture, flinching at the occasional soft crunch of a weevil or the sight of a larva floating in your broth. This was not just bad food, it was a sustained physical assault. Malnutrition would creep in slowly, sapping your energy, thinning your hair, making your skin pale and prone to sores. Now honestly consider it. Could you endure 66 straight days of this? No fresh fruit, no crisp vegetable, no clean, cold water. Just the monotonous, salty chew of leathery meat, the bland slog of peas porridge, and the ever-present anxiety of what might be crawling in your next mouthful. When we frame it this way, the Pilgrims' endurance transforms from a historical fact into a staggering human achievement. Their survival was not passive. It was an active, daily defiance of their own bodies' desperate needs. That struggle for a single bite of fresh food echoes far beyond the cold shores of Plymouth. The Pilgrims' desperate adaptation to a new world did more than just keep them alive. It planted the seeds of a national identity, one you can still taste today. Their absolute reliance on maize, or corn, transformed it from a curious grain into the bedrock of American agriculture. In those first fragile years, corn was not a choice. It was the only thing that grew reliably enough to ward off starvation. This necessity cemented its place. As colonies spread, settlers carried corn seed with them, pushing its cultivation west across the continent. It became the calorie engine of frontier expansion, feeding pioneers, livestock, and eventually a growing nation. That golden kernel, once a life-saving theft from a Wampanoag storage pit, grew into a vast agricultural empire, shaping the land itself and becoming a symbol of American abundance. The holiday born from their survival is an even more direct legacy. That three-day harvest gathering in 1621, a diplomatic celebration of a successful corn harvest, established a template. While not an annual event for them, the story was retold and romanticized over centuries. In the 19th century, writers and leaders seized upon it as a founding myth of unity and gratitude. It was President Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, who finally declared a national Thanksgiving holiday, hoping to foster unity by appealing to this shared, nostalgic origin story. The modern feast, with its turkey and pies, is a creation of later eras, but its emotional core, the idea of giving thanks for a harvest and for community, sprouts directly from those exhausted survivors and their Wampanoag guests sharing a meal in the autumn sun. Perhaps the most delicious legacy, however, is on the plate. The fusion that began in their cookpots, the blending of English stewing techniques with Native American ingredients like corn, beans, squash, and maple, formed the foundation of New England cuisine. Think of a classic pot of baked beans, slow simmered with molasses and salt pork. The beans are native, the molasses from Caribbean sugar traded by Europeans, and the slow cooking method is pure English hearth cookery. Or consider clam chowder, a creamy soup built on the shellfish the Pilgrims gathered to survive, thickened with their ship's biscuit or later, potatoes. Every spoonful is a history lesson. This culinary blending was not a polite exchange of recipes. It was a practical, gritty necessity for survival that created a whole new food culture. Their entire ordeal, from the weevil-infested biscuits to the autumn harvest, reveals a fundamental truth about the American story, often glossed over in favor of politics and ideals. The first chapter of settlement was not about liberty or religion. It was about lunch. It was a brutal daily fight for calories, a war against spoilage and scarcity. Their resilience was not just spiritual or political. It was profoundly physical. The ability to adapt, to learn from those who knew the land, and to fuse old ways with new resources, was the only reason their colony, and those that followed, did not vanish into the forest. When we sit down to a meal today, surrounded by impossible abundance, we are the beneficiaries of that desperate, hungry winter. The story of what the Pilgrims ate is not a quaint sidebar to history. It is the very ground upon which America was built, one hard, necessary bite at a time. From salted weevils to succotash, their plates charted a map of survival. The Pilgrims' voyage was a culinary odyssey as dramatic as their quest for a new life. A story where faith and famine walked hand in hand. They boarded the Mayflower with a larder designed for endurance, not enjoyment, trusting in rock-hard biscuits and leathery salt meat to sustain them. That trust was tested by storms, spoilage, and a voyage that stretched far beyond its intended length, pushing them to the very edge of starvation. Their salvation did not come from the barrels they brought, but from the land they found. The discovery of Wampanoag corn was a lifeline, and the subsequent alliance and shared knowledge transformed them from desperate foragers into capable farmers. The first Thanksgiving was not the beginning of their story, but a hard-won milestone, a celebration of a harvest that proved they could finally feed themselves in this new world. This journey reframes the entire narrative. We remember the Pilgrims for their religious convictions, and rightly so. But their legacy is equally rooted in the gritty, daily reality of the dinner table. Their freedom was won not only through prayer, but through the brutal labor of digging clams from frozen sand, the patient skill of planting corn with a dead fish, and the profound gratitude of a shared deer roast after a starving winter. Our own modern abundance, our very food culture, is built upon such foundational struggles. The next time you enjoy a buttery ear of corn, a bowl of creamy clam chowder, or even the symbolic turkey at your own table, remember the incredible journey it represents. It is a taste of history, born from desperation, adaptation, and an unlikely partnership that changed a continent. What single fact about the Pilgrims' food shocked you the most? Was it the weevils in the hardtack, the theft of the corn, or the sheer monotony of their survival rations? Let us know in the comments below. And subscribe to join us as we continue to uncover the hidden, human stories behind the mysteries of history.